But I decided to just try looking for leases, which in our case obviously is anything in the county courthouse docs, that just happened to mention solar. So I started doing some searches. In this case, I was just looking anything over the last 10 years across the database that happened to mention solar. And then I did the same thing for wind. Uh, when you start looking into those various result sets, you start to find other names. Like you might find that people are starting to use the term renewable inside their name. So, but just for starters, I just went with solar. And so when you start to look for anything that's got related to solar, you can occasionally find references like to an address or something. It might be like 180 Solar Drive or something like that. Like we're not obviously interested in those. So I just do a query using kind of the advanced filter down here in the bottom where I don't really care which way the conveyance is at this point. I'm just looking for entities that either may be a lessor or a lessee or grantor, grantee that contains solar, and start to run that query. So if you go to the map, for example, I can start to see across Texas and Oklahoma where there might be properties related to solar. Okay. A quick example is, let's go look at in New Mexico. And this is where, if you go in and start to take a look at the imagery, you can start to see whether these are potentially existing facilities or maybe something that's under construction. You can actually start to see solar arrays here. So this is a case where there's actually a facility already in place. As I've started to look at these, it gets kind of interesting because you can see a lot of places where it's in a planning stage. Sometimes the imagery shows surface work where you can kind of see things look like they're beginning, and then other stuff is like completely greenfield. You start to see acreage that's been taken by something that's has a name solar in it, so it seems to maybe relate to something that's going to be under construction in the future, but it actually hasn't started yet. So I did the same thing for wind. Kind of took the same approach and just looked for names that had, again, either lessor or lessee wind, and started to map those. So we'll add those in. If you start to add the wind projects, obviously you start to see a lot of really interesting things going on. All this concentration up here in the Panhandle, I believe, is associated with this giant wind catcher project that's been on the books in Oklahoma for a while. You can start to see interesting kind of linear setups for wind, where they're probably trying to either go across a power line or something else that's pre-existing. You can obviously start to see huge concentrations of projects. I had this one here. This was I think in Kay County. What I found in Oklahoma is that there are, as I mentioned, there's a lot of places where you can see existing infrastructure, but there is a lot of stuff that appears to be kind of on the books. You'll start to see examples of wind turbines in these areas. So here's a line of them right here. So in this case, you're starting to see where there's actually pre-existing infrastructure. But as I mentioned, there's a lot of places here, particularly in Oklahoma, where there is stuff. You can see people are picking up, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres, really. And obviously planning and anticipating that there will be a wind project at some point. So I did the same thing with the renewable, just again playing around with the names, and so kind of the same process. And after a while, you start to kind of fill in some of the blanks here. So I'm going to open that up for renewables. One of the things that I found you can start to play more detective with is once you start finding some areas using kind of obvious names like solar or wind. I didn't like sun. Like sun wasn't great because there's a lot of addresses and things related to sun. Solar seemed to be kind of a better bet. What I found though is you'll start to find other names that may not have solar or wind in them, but they appear to be associated. So what I'll do is go in, find a solar project, then do an area of interest search on let's say all the lease data over the last 10 years, And I found like a company, for example, today just found one called Scout Energy, and they have 4 funds, but it appears to me like their fourth fund is looking at more projects that may have renewables. So in this case, I found them actually up in uh, Oklahoma. But when I looked at their assets down in Texas, what I found, like this one's pretty interesting. Let's turn these guys on. So here's this Scout Energy. So you can get an idea of just kind of the swath that these guys have taken. So I found Scout Energy by finding them adjacent to something I found in Oklahoma that was specifically called wind. But I saw a huge, relatively large acreage position by the Scout Energy Fund in Oklahoma. That gave me the ability then to go back and go back to the search interface and just looking for everything's under Scout Energy 4. And then this one showed up, which I thought was just kind of interesting in Texas. Because this is a good example of probably like multi-use, where you're actually able to go in and you can see there's well pads in this area as well, but there's also obviously a bunch of wind turbines going in here. So I don't know anything about these guys. I kind of looked them up online. I didn't see a lot of specific reference to renewables, but this Scout Energy 4 fund is relatively new. And so I have a feeling that fund is being, I don't know these guys, but I have a feeling that fund's probably being committed to assets where there may be multi-use here, where you could basically potentially get involved in oil and gas production, but also have renewable energy projects nearby. So the other thing that I added is I found USGS actually has a nice spatial layer. It's a little dated. It was originally from 2014. It looks like it was last updated in 2017, so it's definitely dated. But it is a data set of all wind turbines in the US. And so this was kind of interesting to me. So this is kind of like the next step, right? So like this is an example of where here's some overlap. It doesn't surprise me where we've already kind of identified an area based on just looking at the assignment and the acreage language. Like I would have known, based on these guys, this, Tahoka wind, right? So I'm not surprised that we see a cluster of turbines here. What gets interesting to me is, start to look at other clusters of wind turbines and then do an AOI search around that area and start looking at the various courthouse data. And like the same thing I did with Scout Energy, see if you can start to find some common names and then in turn be able to search on those. And that's how you go from, finding things that were overtly named with solar or wind in the name, which is kind of a giveaway, or renewables, or something that's just, obviously we wouldn't pick it out just from the name. We wouldn't know. But I think this is how we can start to do some cross correlation here. So if you guys haven't done stuff like this in the past, you actually can, I think, start to use our data sets to start to look at some of these renewable like projects.